Chapter 10 examines the transition from adolescence into adulthood, which, for most people in the United States, occurs sometimes during the 20s. As the chapter points out, the United States is a culture without formal rites of passage, where adulthood is usually self-defined. Research on adulthood has uncovered significant developmental shifts in cognition, moral reasoning, and personality development. The chapter also looks at physical development and health issues, including a current controversy surrounding binge drinking on college campuses. Now, additionally, social, gender, and ethnic issues in health psychology are also part of our discussion. Now, to highlight the unique features of development discussed in this chapter, you will want to refer to the foundations of cognitive development provided in chapters 4 and 6, while the section on personality can be linked to the concept of identity in chapter 9. This chapter introduces physical, cognitive, and personality development in emerging adulthood, which can be linked successfully with many of the moral issues of adulthood to be introduced later, and include marriage, divorce, and remarriage in chapter 11, work and family concerns in chapter 12, occupational dilemmas also in chapter 12, the care of aging family members in chapter 13, and even death and dying in chapter 16. Now, there are a number of different roles that help mark the transition into adulthood. Emerging adulthood is the period when individuals are not adolescents but not yet fully adults. It is the distinctive period from the late teens to the mid to late 20s. Now, the most widely used criteria for deciding whether a person has reached adulthood or not happens to be related to the transitions they experience, which involve assuming new responsibilities and roles. Cultures in the developing world tend to be clearer about when a person becomes an adult. Some societies use rituals called rites of passage to mark this transition quite clearly. Rites of passage may involve highly elaborate steps that may take days, weeks, or may even be compressed into a small, very few minutes. There are religious rituals, which include confirmation, bar and mat mitzvahs, as well as the Latin American consiera. There's marriage. There are tribal rituals that mark the transition to adulthood, and they tend to be public and may involve pain or even mutilation. Western culture has very few formal or clearly defined rituals, which makes it difficult to use any one event as the marker for becoming an adult. Now, the most widely used criteria for deciding whether a person has reached adulthood are those roles transitions, which involve assuming new responsibilities and duties. Some of those responsibilities include voting, completing one's education, beginning full-time employment, leaving home, financial independence, getting married, or even becoming a parent. Research cohort effects show increasing average levels of education are leading to later marriages and children living with their parents far longer. Western society has no clear age constant rituals that clearly mark the transition into adulthood, so there are less defined markers that are employed, including the initiation into a fraternity or a sorority, the choice to consume alcohol, or even the choice to be involved in a romantic relationship. Neuroscience and behavior also influence emerging adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until at least the mid-20s, which means simply that higher levels of reasoning are not possible prior to early adulthood. Young adults are more able than adolescents to take on different points of view. Emerging adults engage in more risky behaviors than do any other age group. Edge work is the desire to live more on the edge through physically and emotionally threatening situations. Base jumping, for example, waterfall kayaking, free solo climbing. Well-planned applications of expertise as opposed to reckless behavior. When examining gender differences in edge work, men tend to be highly confident and use less rehearsal, while women tend to have more qualms and also use more rehearsal. Now, as adolescents move into emerging adulthood, achieving milestones like the completion of education, entering the workforce, and various life stages, including Erickson's psychosocial stages of development, become important. One of the most common markers of adulthood in the United States is the completion of one's education. Nearly 70% of all high school graduates go to college. The rates in upper income groups are higher than in lower income groups. The rates of attending college vary across racial and ethnic groups. Research has documented how students develop while in college. Advances in intellectual development and personal and social identity help students start thinking like adults. Social interactions, supported within an active learning process, can facilitate the development of one's sense of identity. Campus discussions and joining social movements are also examples of this process. College campuses are changing with an increase in the number of returning adult students, which simply means that there are more students over the age of 25 returning to education. Returning adult students tend to be problem solvers, very self-directed and pragmatic. They have relevant life experiences they can integrate with their coursework. They tend to experience more stress, but support from family and the positive effects of continuing one's education act as stress reduction. Many express a sense of self-discovery. But for all students, going to college has an impact on their lives, and for traditional students, it helps to foster the transition into adulthood. Now, a major task for adults is to deal with Erikson's sixth stage, or what is called intimacy versus isolation. Men and career-oriented women solve identity issues before dealing with intimacy concerns, while some women resolve intimacy issues before dealing with identity matters. Some women deal with both identity and intimacy issues simultaneously, or even intimacy before identity. In other words, Erikson's idea that identity must be resolved before intimacy is most applicable only in the case of men and career-oriented women. The struggle for finding one's way into the real world has a number of unique challenges. Students encounter financial debt from education costs. There's always the challenges of networking and time management, as well as searching for meaning and self-exploration. Some emerging adults feel locked out, which simply means they feel unable to enter their adult roles. They also often will feel trapped in those adult roles. Independence reflects the longer time it takes the more recent generations to traverse the challenges of early adulthood. It leads to an interesting question. So, when actually do people become adults? The evidence is clear that a stage of emerging adulthood does exist. Achieving adulthood takes much longer today. Shedding of formal rites of passage like religious ceremonies will leave less clarity to the point at which a young person becomes an adult. Defining oneself as an adult rests on one's perception of whether personally relevant key criteria have been met. Now let's consider physical development and health in emerging adulthood. Young adulthood is the time when several physical abilities peak: height, strength, muscle development, coordination, dexterity, and sensory acuity. Most of these abilities begin to decline in middle age. Young adults are almost always at the peak of their health. Death from disease is relatively rare, especially during the 20s. The leading cause of death among emerging adults is accidents. There are more important gender and ethnic differences as well. Men are more likely to die than women. African American and Latino young adult males are 2 to 2.5 times more likely to die than European Americans. Asian and Pacific Islander younger adult males are likely to die at half the rate of European Americans. It might be important to know that smoking is the single biggest contributor to health problems in adulthood. Non-smokers who breathe secondhand smoke are at considerably higher risk for smoking-related disease. Although difficult, stop smoking. It has its many health benefits. For other emerging adults, drinking alcohol poses few health risks as long as they do not drink and drive. One type of drinking that is particularly troublesome among young adults, especially college students, is known as binge drinking. Now, for men, binge drinking is defined as consuming 5 or more drinks in a row within the past 2 weeks. For women, the definition is consuming 4 or more drinks in a row within the previous 2 weeks. Now, the rates of alcohol problems are highest among adults between the ages of 18 and 24. Some of the problems related to binge drinking include alcohol-related date rape, assault, death from drinking too much alcohol, alcohol use disorder, which is a drinking pattern that results in significant and recurrent consequences that reflect loss of reliable control over alcohol use, as well as excessive long-term drinking that can deplete or increase levels of some chemicals, which causes the body to crave alcohol to restore good feelings or to avoid negative feelings. A number of different treatment approaches have been found for problem drinkers, including Alcoholics Anonymous, treatment centers, medication, and even counseling. Now, another lifestyle factor for emerging adults is nutrition. Nutritional needs change somewhat across adulthood, mostly due to differences in metabolism or how much energy the body actually needs. Research tells us there's a direct link between diet and one's mental, emotional, and physical functioning. It is also clear that foods high in saturated fat are linked to cardiovascular disease. Healthy diets should consist of foods that lower the level of cholesterol. Low-density lipoproteins, or the LDLs, cause fatty deposits to accumulate in arteries, which then impede blood flow. High-density lipoproteins help keep arteries clear and break down LDLs. Now, the ratio of LDL to HDL in serum cholesterol is an important risk factor in cardiovascular disease. Obesity is also a growing health problem related to diet. One's body mass index is a ratio of body weight to height and is related to total body fat. BMI is also related to the risk of serious medical conditions and mortality. The higher one's BMI, the higher one's risk for several diseases. There are a number of other social factors related to health in emerging adulthood, and three of the most important social factors in health are socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and education. If you didn't know, being poor is a major predictor of health challenge. In the United States, ethnic differences exist in the quality of health care received. When poor minorities in the United States have access to health care, they're less likely than European Americans to receive treatment for chronic disease. The risk of dying also increases as educational level decreases. The lower quantity and quality of health care are outcomes of lower educational levels. Cognitive development is also an important aspect of emerging adulthood. How is it that we should view the intelligence of adults? Most modern theories of intelligence are what we call multidimensional. In other words, they identify several types of intellectual abilities. Sternberg emphasized multidimensionality in his theory of successful intelligence. Baltz and his colleagues introduced three other concepts as vital to intellectual development in adults. They're called multidirectionality, which is when some aspects of intelligence improve while other aspects decline. There is interindividual variability, which are patterns of change that vary from one person to the other, as well as plasticity, in which various abilities are not fixed but can be modified under the right conditions at just about any point in adulthood. So, how is it that we actually study intelligence? The psychometric approach studies how interrelationships among intellectual abilities are organized. Pardon me. The structure of intelligence is the organization of interrelated intellectual abilities. Testing and factor analysis lead to a factor, or the relationship between the performance on one test and the performance on another test being identified as a common ability. Most psychometric theorists believe intelligence consists of several factors. We also need to understand primary and secondary mental abilities. Intellectual abilities can be studied as groups of related skills that are primary. Secondary mental abilities are broader intellectual skills that are measured indirectly and help organize the primary mental ability. Fluid intelligence consists of abilities that make people adaptive and flexible thinkers. Fluid abilities generally decline across adulthood. Crystallized intelligence reflects knowledge that people acquire through life experience and education in a particular culture. Crystallized abilities improve until late in life. Individual differences in crystallized intelligence increase with age because maintaining crystallized intelligence depends on being in situations that require its use. Parieto-frontal integration theory is a theory that proposes that intelligence comes from a distributed and integrated network of neurons in the parietal and frontal lobes of the brain. P-fit theory also accounts for individual differences in intelligence as having their origins in individual differences in brain structure and function. The neural efficiency hypothesis suggests that intelligent people process information more efficiently, showing weaker neural activations in a smaller number of areas than less intelligent people. Evidence is mounting that with greater intelligence does come demonstrably increased efficiency in neural processing. Moving into adulthood also considers the notion of formal operations. It's important that we understand how emerging adults think into their adulthood. Post-formal thought is characterized by the recognition that truth may vary from one circumstance to another, that solutions must be realistic, that ambiguity and contradiction are the rule, and that emotion and subjectivity play a role in thinking. Post-formal thinking has its origins in young adulthood. One description of the development of thinking in adulthood is reflective judgment, which is a way in which adults reason through dilemmas involving current affairs, religion, science, personal relationships, and the like. There is a systematic progression of reflective judgment. We begin with pre-reflective reasoning, which is when people do not acknowledge and may not even perceive that knowledge is uncertain. Understanding is gained through the word of an authority figure or by first-hand observation. Next is quasi-reflective reasoning, which is recognition that knowledge contains elements of uncertainty without understanding how evidence entails a conclusion. Reflective reasoning, which is accepting that knowledge claims cannot be made with certainty and must be reevaluated in the view of new evidence. Now, when it comes to integrating emotion and logic in emerging adulthood, adults must understand that there is always going to be more than one right answer. This type of thinking is characterized by the integration of emotion with logic. As emerging adults age, they tend to make decisions and analyze problems not so much on logical grounds, but rather on pragmatic and emotional grounds. The integration of emotion with logic provides the basic for decision-making in a very personal and sometimes difficult arena of love and work. Now, evidence from neuroimaging research indicates that emotion and logic processing is integrated in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the anterior insula, as well as the amygdala. Did you know that there's even what we call an emotional intelligence quotient that goes along with a regular intelligence quotient? Emotional intelligence refers to a person's ability to recognize his or her own and others' emotions, to correctly identify and appropriately tell the difference between emotions, and to use that information to guide their own thinking and behavior. It's a trait that reflects a person's self-perceived disposition and ability, an ability that reflects the person's success at processing emotional information in social contexts, and emotional intelligence also increases with age and may contribute to higher subjective well-being. Hess and Pulin in 1994 found that older adults modify their impression of a person from positive to negative when negative information follows positive. Older adults modify their impression less when positive information follows negative, while younger adults make their impression based on the most recent information and do not show a difference in their impression based on whether the new information was positive or negative. Older adults tend to rely more on life experiences and social rules of behavior, while younger adults are more concerned with situational consistency of the new information that's presented. An interesting question for younger emerging adults is simply this: who or what do you want to be when you grow up? While many may not realize it, much of adulthood is about the creating of life stories. Young adults create lifespan constructs that represent unified senses of the past, the present, and the future, and they are manifested in two ways. Through a scenario that maps out the future based on a social clock, which involves tagging future events with a particular time or age by which they are to be completed, or a life story, which is a personal narrative that organizes past events into a coherent sequence. The life story begins to form in early life and is created and revised across adulthood. Coherence in a life story begins with the formation of an identity. It's also defined through intimacy and refashioned in the wake of life changes throughout adulthood. Such life stories involve agency, or the power and achievement of autonomy, as well as communion, including love, intimacy, and a sense of belonging. In 2001 and in 2015, McAdams' research suggested that a model for change in identity over time is a process of fashioning and refashioning of one's life story. As a part of our life story creation, people create possible selves by projecting themselves into the future and thinking what they would like to become, what they would like to be, and what they're afraid of becoming. Age differences in these projections depend on the dimensions that are examined. Adolescents and young adults are far more likely to have multiple selves and to believe more strongly that they can actually become the hoped-for self and successfully avoid the feared self. Personal control beliefs reflect the degree to which you believe your performance in a situation depends on something you do. A high sense of personal control implies a belief that performance is up to you, while a low sense of personal control implies that your performance is under the influence of forces other than yourself. Schultz and Heckhausen in 2013 and in 2010 suggested that a lifespan model is necessary to describe the differences between primary and secondary control. Primary control is behavior aimed at affecting the individual's external world, while secondary control is behavior or cognition that's aimed at affecting the individual's internal world, believing that one is capable of success even when faced with challenges. What about for those of you who are involved in this class? Are you at the age where you are considered an emerging adult? What kind of struggles or inconsistencies, or even perhaps consistencies, do you encounter as your education continues to unfold? I'd love to hear more about it.